Good afternoon. I am Tom Zetterstrom from Canaan, Connecticut, a tree preservationist and fine arts photographer. Um, and I've been working on various invasive projects with the Sharon Land Trust for half a dozen years. Today's talk is on Oriental Bittersweet, the tree killing vine. And we will be looking at examples of tree preservation in the Mary Moore Preserve and drawing on other examples of preservation in a tri-state region. We will begin the talk. Uh, Celastris orbiculatus describes in Latin what this plant is: rounded leaves, rapid growing vine, envelops canopies, displaces natives. And later on, we will discuss mechanical and chemical controls. The landscape of 100 years ago in overlooking Beardsley Pond was stewarded by farmers, and invasive management or vegetation management occurred by grazing. And agriculture was intense then, and hedgerows were clear and tight. Um, Forests were clearly defined and standing. Open space was enhanced by the deep vistas of agricultural use. So beautiful was the landscape that in the 1980s, Landvest proposed to develop 40 lots surrounding Beardsley Pond. Thankfully, Mary Moore stepped in and put an end to that foolishness and preserved the rural landscape of Sharon. Over the years, early succession occurs as agricultural use shrinks and various species become established. It was on a walk that in 2015, with Roger Liddell and Deborah Moore and Sarah Kuhn, then director of the Sharon Land Trust, that we took careful note of the Chinkapin oak. We hadn't even identified its species then, but we were concerned that vines were crawling all the way to the top of the canopy. With loppers and chainsaws and a tool called the buckthorn blaster, we cut and treated with glyphosate the various 9 stems at the base of the tree, using barely an ounce of chemistry, highly targeted, optimally timed, and judiciously used. 2 weeks later, the foliage from the vines fell to the floor of the forest to reveal a canopy of encumbered by the vines and their fruit, thousands and thousands of berries and seeds. Next month in September, Keith Cudworth of the White Memorial Foundation joined us for a certain identification of the tree, which turned out to be a Chinkapin oak. We submitted the dimensions to the Connecticut Notable Trees program at Connecticut College, and lo and behold, that 45-inch diameter trunk with a 100-foot spread and a 92-foot height was a champion state tree of that species. Chinkapin, rare in New England because it is primarily seen across the middle west states, but only in western New England, in this tiny little area of Berkshire and Litchfield County, due to the soil types: high pH, limestone soils. The geology allowed this tree to grow here. We celebrated it subsequently, and also continued monitoring and managing the surrounding forests. In 2019, We did a project called haloing, which expands the perimeter of light around the full circumference of the tree to allow stronger canopy growth. Roger Liddell, just in the spring of 2021, went around with his vacuum cleaner to collect gypsy moth egg masses, so we could reduce any further defoliation by that invasive insect. The canopy looks strong, the tips are vital, and the leaves will emerge this year. And we expect this tree to be with us for many years to come. Doug Talamay includes Quercus, native oaks, as highest among keystone species, those which really create the native plant anchors that enhance wildlife, bird life, insect interaction throughout the food web. At the Chinkapin, we interrupted the growth of the bittersweet vines at a fairly late point, probably near the line that shifts from active to reactive management, nearing the uh, biological potential of the plant. Had we waited another 5 years, I suspect that upper canopy would have been snuffed out by that foliage, certainly within 10 years. 75-year vines were allowed to grow in the Scoville Sanctuary of Salisbury. And we don't even know if this is indeed the biological potential. Perhaps in 50 years or 100 years, we would see something even more horrific. On my own property, a 4-inch hop hornbeam, the hardest understory tree, was being wrapped, twined by a half-inch bittersweet vine, proportionate to the vines in the 4-foot Chinkapin oak. And this certainly would have spelled certain death to this little tree. So one cut with a lopper and a milliliter of glyphosate applied immediately to the cut stem killed that root system and resolved the future of that tree, such that it has a future. Bill Schlesinger, excuse me, former director of the Cary Arboretum, presented research that indicates under elevated CO2, vines will grow 25% faster than under ambient CO2 levels. So, as aggressive as they already are, more aggressiveness can be anticipated. This really steers us in the direction of early detection and rapid response. Let's get to these bittersweet vines before they become half an inch, 4 inches, 9 inches in diameter. Here, Peter Kent, picking 1-year seedlings at the Scoville Sanctuary, has performed a great act of environmental impact, perhaps having preserved a half a dozen trees in that 5 minutes it took him. Those 1-year seedlings come up from the ground with their roots intact. But 2-year plants really start to get to the point where certain fragments are left behind. And this becomes a problem because these propagules will resprout. So, with mechanical management in mind, early detection is important. Young plants can be extracted with their entire root systems. Cutting alone with a lopper doesn't do the job. Here, one vine becomes 5 vines. Here are some 3-inch vines in the Scoville Sanctuary that were simply cut, and they became 4 vines, became 40 vines. The same principle applies to shrub invasives such as autumn olive or buckthorn. This plant I had cut years ago when it was only a small half-inch stem. And when I went back this year, I had to cut 6, 8 stems and treat them all because the roots were not killed. Very effectively, the Sharon Land Trust has a policy of trail management, working with volunteers and staff and board members. Cut the invasive plant, place a flag. Tim Hunter follows with the buckthorn blaster, pulls up the flag, and treats the stem. This amplifies Tim's effectiveness tenfold. He won't have to come back and repeat that cycle 2 or 3 years later because the roots will have been killed. If you're not carrying the right tools, but have tape in your pocket, mark vines to return later. Here we see in the Mary Moore Preserve what might be considered a specimen invasive plant, the buckthorn, glossy buckthorn. That should be cut at the stem and treated around the sapwood of the tree to kill the root system. Resolved. Tools are simple. A little homemade holster carrying the applicator, which is a 4-ounce bottle, available online under Buckthorn Blaster, a little hand clipper, amplify that with a lopper and a chainsaw under certain circumstances. Here, Roger is standing beneath a 70-foot shagbark hickory, enveloped by bittersweet vines, probably 15 or 20 of them, reaching all the way to the top of the canopy. That tree, one of the strongest hardwoods in the forest, was doomed. Again, 5 or 10 years later, it would have been snagged and just dangling there to support the vines and distribute seeds into the future, perhaps decades into the future. Because those vines were not treated already, resprouting is occurring, and you can see the tangling and twining of the vines that are just forming their little ropes and looking for something to grab and head up the next opportunity. Even in the interior of Mary Moore Preserve, trees have toppled from this vine. Cut and treat will save these cherry trees. There's a red oak that, left untreated, will succumb. And what we don't see in this seasonal winter picture is what's going on up in the canopy, where tens of thousands of seeds are being produced at an exponential rate from year to year as the vines grow. Back at the Mary Moore Preserve upper field, we see encroaching bittersweet on the hedgerow that runs the full length of the upper meadow. It's well within the management area now. Left unchecked, it will consume the hedgerow. Across Beardsley Pond, the same problem exists in plantings that were established early on to protect that reservoir from road dust and just general cooling, let's say. Hedgerows on the side of Route 7 were planted when the road was built, and 20 trees were gradually reduced to 6 and gradually reduced to 4 and now reduced to 2 over a decade period. So the impact is relentless and progressive. At Salisbury School, a cluster of white pines were snagged, toppled, and removed, converted to lawn. So here you have no carbon sequestration, you have no diversity, you have a monoculture of grass perpetuated by a, gas-powered lawnmower. Kent Land Trust in Kent Fields, south of town, did the smart thing. They severed those vines and removed them such that native plants and grasses and forbs could return to that hedgerow. On a farm that doesn't use herbicides but preferred weed whacker, the effect of weed whacking the bittersweet was simply to exacerbate the problem, stimulate lateral growth and sprouting such that the fence becomes a trellis to support the vines. Birds land on fences, they void seeds. That's how they get there. Even a seed rolling into a crack in the asphalt will establish itself and eventually, even within an 8-foot height, begin to produce seeds if it's in full sun. Forest edges are vulnerable, as are all edges, such as roadside edges and hedgerows and lake edges. and trail edges, even where birds come in and light void seeds and plants begin to grow. Eventually, this will collapse the forest. With one charge of a buckthorn blaster, that being about 4 ounces, this grove of civilian conservation corps conifers was saved at Reynolds Rockwell Park in Salisbury. Here, lack of management on the side of the DOT Lime Rock Road, you see curtaining effect of invasive plants that simply shroud the um, trees beneath, snag them, collapse them, and will undoubtedly progress further up into the forest. Here we see white pines teetering in the final days or years of their existence, with vines reaching to the top. A shagbark hickory on another Sharon Land Trust preserve these were severed. Here, twining vines going up a cottonwood. So obviously the species of the host tree is inconsequential to the vine. Anything upright is a fair target. When you add snow and ice weight and wind to the carrying capacity of the vines and the weighting of the trees, forest collapse is even more likely. In one site at Houstonic Valley Regional High School, we recaptured a devastated uh, bank of the campus, removed all invasives, established a pollinator meadow, and 5 years later, the Connecticut Ag Experimental Station captured and counted 17 species of wild bees. We dramatically enhanced the ecosystem services of that environment. On the east side of Red Mountain, bittersweet vines are encroaching into the forest, and mechanical means are being used to try to salvage the old meadows. On the west side of Red Mountain, we look at the Marymore Preserve coming down from the Chinkapin to the water's edge in late fall. And unfortunately, the brilliance of the red fall color is a signal that bittersweet vines are high in the trees and yielding large quantities of seeds to carpet bomb the rest of the environment. Mowing 2 years ago revealed what was left of that woodland, and not a very high functioning ecosystem, sorry to say. Seeds from the high canopies were scattered among the shredded vegetation. It should be understood that mowing alone does not kill the roots, nor do goats. The grazing is indiscriminate and kill both native and invasive plants. 8 weeks after mowing on a site Doolittle Lake, we marked all the resprouts with white paint, and you can see those plants resprout with a vengeance. At the Washini Park model in Salisbury, after 16 80-year-old trees were cut up, removed, burned, and disposed of, the meadows were mowed. Um, it turned out that 80% of the foliage of the meadow was bittersweet foliage. So the following year, after a late May mowing in late June, about 6 weeks later, um, each of those resprouting bittersweet vines was targeted with triclopyr, a broadleaf herbicide that doesn't kill grasses. A few weeks later, all the bittersweet was dead. And by the end of summer, the grass had returned, the meadow was restored. And that was a single treatment on one occasion that accomplished that. So this is nowhere near what some people feel very concerned about, rightly so. The annual, repeated, and annual often, and or even more often than annual repeated use of glyphosate or other chemicals on farmland. This is not what we're doing. This is a big distinction in invasive management. To review, pull small plants, including the entire root system, cut larger ones, and mow every other couple of weeks. Now, you can do that in a lawn, you can't do that in the woods. Chemical control for low, dense patches, as we just described, cut all vegetation to ground level, allow to regrow, then spray foliage with triclopyr. Taller patches, cut stumps with either and treat with triclopyr or glyphosate in late summer. Glyphosate is the more effective chemical. We live in an extraordinary area, and it's sometimes referred to as the Berkshire linkage that connects the mid-Atlantic Appalachians to the northern Appalachians. Within it, there is a lot of conservation land, and it is protected from development, but it's not necessarily protected from invasive plants. The Open Space Institute, developed a model called the resilient landscape, which they propose as a way of connecting properties and large landscape areas. Um, that model works in the pre-invasive concept extremely well. However, when intruded by invasives, it clogs up the understory, tears down trees, and alters the ecosystem. Those buckthorn plants we looked at earlier actually transform the ecology of the soils. It's called allelopathic. Forest succession in invasive zones becomes threatened. Forest succession, it's that predictable pattern of transition from farmland to woodland. A few years later, seedlings appear. Then, under the shade of trees, long-lived species such as beech, sugar maple, or hemlock slowly replace earlier arrivals. Slowly is the key here. This natural native forest succession takes time. Invasives don't permit time. My observations: forest floor congestion leads to inaccessibility. Tree crowns are encapsulated. Exponential increase of seed production. Tree death, tree collapse, expanding ripples of forest collapse. Shift from vertical to horizontal vegetation. Dramatically decrease carbon sequestration and reduce ecosystem services. Doug Talamay replies to my email. My take is that you're exactly right. Succession is dead in invasive zones. It moves to a perpetual tangle of invasive vines. He mentions porcelainberry, bittersweet, mile-a-minute multiflora rose. You could add others like wild kiwi, pulling down and smothering native vegetation. Here we see the chinkapin, resolved of the invasive impact of bittersweet vine and standing as a inspiration for us to do more to keep forests upright. The tree has been identified. It's a signature of the Sharon Land Trust system. It remain a inspiration and celebrated well into the future. This work is informed by a network of science advisors, among them Doug Talamay and various members of the Connecticut Ag Experimental Station, Dr. Todd Mervosh, invasive plant manager, David Gumbart of the Nature Conservancy, Glenn Dreyer of Connecticut College. Thank you for your time. We have a lot of work to do, but it is a worthy cause, and we know the tools and the science to get it done. Good day.